Well, hi, everybody. Pastor Brian here with you again for another 12 o'clock noon chat. This time, I am joined by my brother, Kevin Kiley. Kevin, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. I am just in the process of really working my way through different members of our family who have jobs that make them potentially useful to our audience. I had Christy on my podcast last week to talk about making this time helpful and engaging for kids. And you are a government official who I have some access to, so I figured I would talk to you. And then maybe after this, Dad's a doctor. I could talk to him as well. So anyway, what's that?
Makes your job easy.
Yes, it does make my job easy in terms of tracking down people to talk to. Although I will say this, I have to take the opportunity to give you a hard time for this publicly. What does not make my job easy, and I tell people that I know this all the time, is that if you are and people that know me know this, if you are an extremely nonpartisan pastor who is really not into partisanship at all, it is not great having your brother be your local government representative, because then all of the partisan people want to come talk to you about it, thinking that you're really into that too, which, as you know, I am not. So I just want to thank you for all of the awkward conversations I've had to have over the years.
Oh, sure. That was mainly the reason I decided to cause as much awkwardness as possible.
Yeah, well, mission accomplished. I appreciate that. But obviously, that all aside, the reason I wanted to have you come on today is, again, you're a government official. You are involved in a lot of what's going on in terms of the government response to COVID-19, and you understand a lot of that stuff. So I was just hoping you could share a little bit of your perspective on all of this with our audience. This is obviously a really disorienting time for a lot of people. What kind of impacts are you seeing throughout our district?
Well, the impacts are all encompassing, from what everyone's going through on the community level, the family level, level of society as a whole, where, folks are having the rhythm of their daily lives just utterly changed. And so, you see the very direct impacts, like folks working from home in the best case, or a lot of folks not having work and having to navigate a very complicated unemployment process, or as you know very well, having kids at home who are no longer going to school and having to manage that. And then there's just a whole host of secondary and tertiary impacts that we're seeing. To cite a couple of examples, I was just talking with the director of the food bank, Twin Lakes Food Bank in Folsom. They've seen a huge surge in demand for their services. And I was also talking the other day to the head of Stand Up Placer, which deals with helping victims of domestic violence, and the number of law enforcement reports has doubled since the stay-at-home order went into effect. So, these are very challenging situations to manage, and are continuing to sort of build as this goes on longer.
Yeah, and I would suspect that, I think on a society-wide level, obviously this is going to be something that has an impact for years, if not longer. And we're only just now beginning to see some of those, like you said, secondary and tertiary impacts, and that's likely to continue. And something that our Pastor Lance said to me the other day when we were doing another online thing is that this is a unique situation in that nobody is truly an expert. Not to say that people aren't experts in the specifics, the epidemiology, the economics, and all of that. But this is really unprecedented in terms of anything any of us have seen in our lifetime. And that just creates, obviously, its own set of challenges for people in every level of government, yourself included, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. It's unlike anything any of us have ever had to deal with. And so, we're all doing what we can to manage it in the most informed way possible. But I think a key part of that is just remaining connected with all parts of our communities so that we understand what's going on and can respond to it appropriately.
Yeah. Now, you have a monthly column in a newspaper called the Mountain Democrat. Now, that's a local paper in Placerville. Is that right?
The column runs actually in a bunch of different papers in the area.
Oh, okay. So, excuse me. Sorry for not being up on that. You've got a column that is syndicated across numerous publications. But the column that you wrote recently was really good, just about various elements of the response to all of this. And something you said that was interesting to me, and I'd be curious to have you expand on it a little bit, is you said that social distance need not mean societal distance or spiritual discord. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, gosh, what did I mean by that?
It sounded really good.
Thank you. So yeah, the column actually was just kind of rehashing a speech I gave the last day the legislature was in session, where we were appropriating a bunch of money for the governor to deal with all this, and I was kind of giving my thoughts on what our attitude should be as we enter this unprecedented time. And so, with that statement, I think what I was trying to say is, and we're actually kind of seeing this now reflected in the changing terminology from social distance to physical distancing, is that just because we have these parameters that limit our direct contact with one another, it doesn't mean that we, need to lose the sense of connectedness that is, crucial to healthy communities. And so I think that, folks are finding ways to stay connected, whether it's through Zoom like we are right now, and even opening up new avenues of connection, that in some cases getting to know neighbors who you didn't know all that well, of course, yelling across the porch or across the fence or what have you. So that's really encouraging to see as well. And I guess my broader thought was that, since we're all in this together and dealing with the same thing and fighting against a common problem, then maybe we could rediscover some of the elements of social cohesion that aren't always as present as we might like when it comes to things like politics or other facets of our society.
Yeah, certainly. That was another thing you sort of referenced both in the speech and in the column, was the sense that, okay, obviously you live in the partisan political world, and there is a certain degree of partisan gamesmanship that happens in that world. And to the extent to which, I think for people like me who get sort of irritated by that in normal times, to see that sort of set aside and to see government officials recognizing, okay, at the end of the day, this is not about scoring political points, it's about doing what's best for society and working together. And to the extent that that's happened, that is certainly encouraging to me. And I think it's interesting, to your point about social cohesion, there is something to be said for the fact that we truly are all in this together, that there is nobody who is not affected by this in some way. This is not a localized disaster. This is not something that is affecting one industry. All of us are affected by it in some way. And I think it has been interesting from my perspective to see that on some level that has had a bit of a unifying force in society. And then similarly, like you said, I think the creativity it is bringing up in terms of the effort that is being made to connect beyond the norm, that to me is encouraging. This is obviously a very serious and tragic situation, but to see that the effort that kind of I feel like we're collectively making to stay connected, I don't know, that is encouraging to me in the midst of all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you look at broadly what's happened in California is that we have real evidence now that the social distancing practices are working. And, that's partly because, the governor and others decided to make the right choices early on. But it wouldn't have been possible if we didn't have broad public buy-in, which we have largely had. We've had 40 million people who have radically changed their behavior, the way they go about their lives for the sake of the greater good. And that's really a monumental civic achievement when you think about it.
It absolutely is. And you're right, to get 40 million people to do much of anything is remarkable. And the level of cooperation that we've seen in our state has certainly been helpful. And I think we've seen on a government level the benefits of early action, which you alluded to, which we have not seen in some other states. And unfortunately, the consequences of that have been quite dire. But then at the same time, like you said, there's been public buy-in. Now, in my world, and I don't know if you see much of this, from your perspective, but I am still hearing from a lot of folks who are just trying to make sense of all of this in terms of, okay, why is this social distancing stuff truly that important? Could you just share a little bit? You're not a doctor. I'm not asking you to, we'll talk to Dad about that. I'm not asking you to weigh in about how the disease works, but could you just talk to us from sort of a government perspective? Why is social distancing so important, and why is it such a high priority?
Yeah, well, I mean, the basic, medical fact that I think we're all aware of is that this is a disease that's spread by, direct physical contact or being close to people. And so, and if the ordinary rhythm of life continues, then it will spread like that, and the number of cases grows exponentially. And so, the public policy perspective then comes into play, where you have to deal with hospital capacity, which if you have exponential growth in a short period of time, you just don't have anywhere near the capacity to deal with it. And when this all was starting to spread, the estimates that the governor came up with were that if we didn't make changes, then over half of the population of the state of California would eventually get COVID-19 and would get it, and that it would spread quite rapidly. And so social distancing is really the only practical tool to, as they say, flatten that curve, stop that exponential growth from happening, and allow for our hospital capacity and everything that entails to be able to deal with the cases that do arise.
Yeah, and I would imagine it's somewhat tough, I think, to truly appreciate the devastating public health and public resourcing crisis that it would be to have that level of diagnosis within the state, to have 20 million people infected, and even if a very small percentage of those required serious medical care, there isn't a state in our union that is prepared to deal with that sort of an influx. Right. So that's why it is so important that these drastic measures are taken for a short period of time to minimize the crisis and to really reduce the likelihood of that sort of catastrophic public health situation. Is that more or
That's
less accurate?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, earlier this month, you posted on your Facebook page an infographic that was produced by serve.ca.gov, and it encouraged, it used this language of encouraging neighbor check-ins. What kind of behaviors are you encouraging in the district, and are other kind of your colleagues throughout the state encouraging? And why are these types of check-in type behaviors important from your perspective?
Well, mental health is a big concern right now, with people being isolated, not having the typical level of support they have from the community, from their friends. And so just having folks who are checking in with you, on a regular basis, seeing how you're doing, providing some level of social contact and support is really important. So that's what that campaign was kind of about, is just making sure that this is front of mind for people. If you have friends, if you have relatives, if you know of folks who, might not have a lot of support in their immediate household during this time, then just make a point to check in, see how they're doing. And, I'm sure it'll be greatly appreciated, and it could make a really big difference.
Yeah, that's something that we've talked a lot about at Bridgeway, and that I've certainly tried to practice just privately. Is okay each day thinking, okay, who are a few people that I could just send a text, give a call, just to check in, and certainly trying to prioritize those who maybe might not have a lot of support around them, but even also friends and acquaintances who life just gets to be what it is, and you can go weeks or even months without communication. I think in those types of that type of contact is always valuable, but especially in times like this. And like you said, I think that to sort of reiterate what you said, in many cases, those types of check-ins just might be a nice, okay, that's a nice thing, but you just never know, and that's really going to be a lifeline for somebody who's in need of some support
Yeah,
and some help.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you this: there are still portions of our population who are not inclined to take this all that seriously, and you've addressed that a little bit. But then there are also those who are concerned that this is government overreach. Certainly within the Christian community, there are those who are concerned about religious liberty. Pastor Lance and I did a Q&A session on Sunday night where we addressed that, and we just said, hey, religious liberty is alive and well. It's not, churches are not being targeted here. All gatherings are being targeted, and we're able to do everything we can do online without government interference. But I just want to know, what would you say to those people in one of those two camps, either those who are still not inclined to take this all that seriously, or two, those who are concerned with issues related to government overreach?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is in some sense a natural response in that we, this is by far the most intense level of government restriction any of us have ever faced in our lives. But I think it's sort of a what I'd call like a healthy instinct misfiring, in the sense that, if you're someone who believes in limited government, which I certainly do, what you really believe is that the government ought to stay out of areas that really aren't, its business, like leaving a lot of matters that government might want to be involved in that are better left to the family, or to private enterprise, or to faith communities. And I certainly fight for that in my ordinary job during ordinary times at the Capitol. But there are then some things that are distinctly government tasks, like public safety, police and fire protection, and that sort of thing. And what we have now is paradigmatically one of those situations where you have a problem that is of such a scope and a scale that only government has the tools available to deal with it. So when you see the restrictions that government's putting in place here, that is, in my view, something that is not only appropriate, but is compelled by an understanding of limited government and what its proper role is.
So when you say it's compelled by limited government, are you saying that the government needs to take these steps essentially to avoid having to take greater steps later? Is that the gist of what you're saying, or am I misunderstanding?
Well, that's certainly true as well. But I'd say that, if you're someone like me who believes in limited government, you believe in that because you think that private enterprise and families and communities do a lot of things better, but also because when the government starts getting involved in things it shouldn't, then it doesn't give as much attention to things that it should. And this is one of the things that it really ought to give attention to, right? This is the sort of thing that we rely on government for. And so when you see what we have now with stay-at-home orders and all of that, and these truly, sweeping policy decisions in response to a unprecedented problem, I think that's actually government doing the sort of thing that it's supposed to do. And so I understand why people are sort of like, well, this is really encroachment of government into my life, but it's different than situations where you might respond to that and where there's a real sort of principle behind it.
Yes, this is a situation that is fundamentally different, where people who ascribe to, broadly speaking, your political philosophy would be inclined to say, wait a second, no, this is a government overreach. What you're trying to help us understand is that this is, like you said, this is exactly the sort of thing that the government needs to be paying attention to, because it is for the purpose of public health. And it's for the purpose, ultimately, and this is, my own perspective, that it is sweeping measures for the purpose of reducing long-term impact, which allows all of us, whatever we believe about how limited government should be, it allows all of us to go back to living quote unquote normal lives as quickly as possible. Is that fair?
Yeah,
is that
that's
accurate?
a really important point, is that, if we were, because things are actually starting to look a little better now by all the metrics that we look to, like hospitalization, ICU admissions, and deaths. But if we sort of get complacent and start relenting, then it might all have been for naught, and we'll get back to a point where the disease starts spreading rapidly again, and the long-term suffering will be much worse. And so that's absolutely right.
Yeah, and that was actually something I wanted to ask you about as well, is that because I've been seeing these reports as well, which we're really grateful that obviously the news is starting to look a little bit less dire. Even nationwide, the death predictions are coming down, which, one death you can avoid is a death you want to avoid, right? But anytime the numbers can go down, that's good. That it seems like the curve is starting to flatten, that we've seen some good things in the numbers in the state of California. How concerned are you that could lead to exactly that, though, some complacency? Because that is certainly a thought that has crossed my mind.
Yeah, complacency, and folks just kind of getting tired of living like this, right? So it's really hard right now, I think, to predict in any meaningful way what the next phase of this is going to look like, and ultimately that's going to be up to the governor, and he probably doesn't really know for sure because it's such a dynamic situation. I think that there's an emergent consensus that will probably kind of phase in a return to normal life in some way. And a lot of that's also dependent upon testing capacity and therapeutics and that sort of thing. But I think that it's just, important to emphasize that as long as the folks who are really looking at this from a public health perspective believe that a full-scale return to normal life will only cause the virus to reemerge, then that's ultimately not going to be in our interest in the long term in any sense. It's going to lead to longer periods of social distancing, and it's going to lead to a lot more suffering.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point, and I'm glad that you make it. And I think for us just to recognize that the inconvenience, I'll be the first to acknowledge very significant inconvenience to many people that shelter in place and the closing of businesses is causing. That is ultimately all in the name of preventing much greater suffering. And if we can, as a society, uh, work through this next period of time, that is ultimately going to be in our best interests.
That's right.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much for the time. I appreciate it. Thank you for all the work that you're doing in our community, you and all of your colleagues throughout the Assembly and the Senate and all levels of government. We appreciate it, and I'll see you at Zoom family dinner on Easter.
Family dinner, exactly.
All right, thanks, Kevin.
Yeah.